Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And today we're back with another Elvis album review. Specifically, we're talking about Elvis's Gold Records Volume 2, though in practice, this album has come to be known as 50 Million Elvis Fans Can't Be Wrong. This is the third Elvis album review I'm doing for the channel. As I said, I've been kind of torn because on the one hand, Elvis is a giant name in music and an important name in music for me too, especially when I was younger. At the same time, he wasn't really an album artist. It's not like lots of his albums were concepts where he carefully came up with songs and an accompanying album art. No, he just put out a lot of singles. So that said, I discussed his final album, Moody Blue. I discussed his first album, Elvis Presley, and I figured it would at least be fun to discuss this one just because it's such an iconic image. And it has inspired various other artists throughout history who don't necessarily have 50 million fans. I should mention that this technically does not count as a studio album. It's what's called a compilation album, so the equivalent of a greatest hits album. But again, because Elvis wasn't really an albums artist, the distinction doesn't matter as much for him. Back when he was recording, the single was king. You were putting out individual songs on little 45 records. And so these are songs recorded between 1957 and 1958. They're not on any other album. Basically, Elvis had so much output at the beginning of his career that he already had enough material for multiple greatest hits records before, many artists would have put out more than one or two studio albums. So I think for all intents and purposes, this is a studio album, and I think beyond that, it tells us something about Elvis's development as a performer. So a lot of rock stars of the 1950s, they didn't have much staying power. If you look at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you'll notice some pretty big artists from the 60s or 70s who aren't in there at all. Yet you'll see artists from the 1950s who got there pretty quickly, like Eddie Cochran or Gene Vincent or Ritchie Valens, that didn't seem to have much of a career, but it's because the 50s were so impactful as that founding generation. Now, Elvis was a bit luckier, or a lot luckier than a lot of the artists from the 50s. He got to be known as the king of rock and roll, and his career lasted until his death in 1977. But at the same time, one could argue that the Elvis that really inspired a lot of people, Elvis at his best, was just as flash in the pan as the other 1950s stars. Elvis blew up on the scene with songs like That's All Right Mama, Blue Suede Shoes, and Heartbreak Hotel. The Elvis who took the music world by storm from 1954 to 56 with the spunky kid who sang blues and country, previously segregated genres of music. He had this upbeat swagger. He was this young, rebellious cool, but he quickly changed into a perpetually deep-voiced manly man who sang sentimental ballads. So this album, which consisted of songs released in 57 and 58, already sounds very different from that young Elvis of 54 to 56. Elvis is still a very young man. This is the first decade of his career when this comes out, and yet in just a few years, he has completely transformed. So let's talk about the tracks on this album. Firstly, we get I Need Your Love Tonight. Now, this one sort of sounds like classic Elvis, but you can really hear the difference between this one and the first song of his debut record, Blue Suede Shoes. So unlike with Blue Suede Shoes, the rhythm here really comes from the drums and the piano, giving the song a thicker sound. Like Buddy Holly, Elvis tries to make use of little hiccupy exclamations in his singing, like, wowee. But it doesn't sound like Buddy Holly because Elvis is already starting to use the deeper part of his voice. So rather than sounding like the natural, charming geek that Buddy Holly did, it just feels like this weird no man's land between geeky and manly man. Track 2 on the album is called Don't. This one again really makes use of Elvis's deep voice. And also again, we don't hear that simple country blues band as much that was a big part of his early records. The main backing sound on this one is his backing singing group, the Jordanaires. It's not really a rock and roll song at all. The track 3 on the album is called Won't You Wear My Ring. This is actually my favorite song from this album. And while the lyrics are certainly a bit of their time, the idea of wearing a ring around your neck to show you're going steady, I mean, the joy in Elvis's voice, the backup singing, and the hand drums make this song uniquely punchy. Yes, it's not quite the same sound as early Elvis, but I find it to be just as much fun. Then we get another slow one called My Wish Came True. I believe the man who originally sang and I believe recorded the song Ivory, Joe Hunter, was quite a successful singer and songwriter in his own right. This song has that sound that now sounds kind of weirdly vintage. I think of the choral singing in Pinocchio, and there's a nice little buildup at the end of the song that just makes it sound kind of cinematic. The next track is called I Got Stung. So again, this is an example of Elvis trying to do a rocker, and this is one of his regular composers, Aaron Schroeder. There have been a number of important composers on this record. Don't was written by Lieber and Stoller, the writers of Hound Dog. But yeah, so I Got Stung was co-written by Aaron Schroeder, and it's trying to recapture the feel of the early Elvis rockabilly song, but it's not quite getting it. I think it's because the lyrics cram in quite a lot of words, so they don't have that punch of the simple songs of Elvis's career. My baby left me. See, very simple lyric, and it allows Elvis's charisma to come through, whereas here he has to say a fairly long sentence. I got stung by a sweet honeybee. The next track is called One Night. What I like about this one is we get to hear more of Elvis's high voice, because it felt like from the late 50s onwards, Elvis was more and more just emphasizing his low voice, even though his high voice was such a key part of his breakthrough rock and roll sound. And with this song, One Night, I feel like the lusty desperation of both Elvis's performance and lyrics don't match the sort of slow playing of the backup group. It just doesn't quite work for me. The next song, however, is another favorite of mine. It's called A Big Hunk of Love. So again, this one is not quite getting what's great about the earlier 50s Elvis song, but it's just a very energetic and well thought out rock pop kind of tune. Each instrument has its little moment. This one takes advantage of the fact that Elvis's voice sounds kind of kitschy and just has fun with it by leaning it into it with that lyric of, oh, just a big hunk of love will do. The next song, I Beg of You, again, trying to sound something like from the earlier 50s. And I think they do a better job of here. The vocal lines are punchier. I think the only problem is the boom, 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 boom of the backup singers gives it that more wall of sound thing that the later Elvis recordings have, rather than the raw rockabilly of his early sounds. The next one is called Now and Then There's a Fool Such as I. This is a decently catchy song, and I love that Elvis is having fun with his voice. He sometimes uses silly vocal intonations, which is one of the key successes of his earlier recordings. Now and then there's a fool such as I am over you. And then finally, we end with a song called Don't You Think It's Time. I like the emotion in Elvis's delivery here. Again, he's exploring different vocal intonations. I like the line, any other guy. You know, it's hard for someone with as buff a voice as Elvis to sound awkward, but I think he nailed it there. He was charmingly awkward with that vocal delivery. So one of the things I learned while I was researching 50 Million Elvis Fans Can't Be Wrong is that when Elvis first started recording with Sun Studios in Memphis, Tennessee, he was billed not exclusively as the solo star Elvis Presley or Elvis, but also as the lead singer of a band. So his famous backing group of the guitarist Scotty Moore, the double bass player Bill Black, and later the drummer DJ Fontana, they were sometimes billed as the Blue Moon Boys. And I think that dynamic of having a band, of it not just be about showing off Elvis's over-the-top voice, actually made him a better performer at the beginning of his career, because so much of the accents of the rockabilly were just, you know, not just the punchy singing from Elvis, but the punchy guitar playing from Scotty Moore. And the fact that it was such a minimal band, you know, just guitar, bass, drums, forced them to get the most energy, the most catchiness out of the sound. Whereas already with the songs just a couple years later, they're using more instruments, and the individual instruments don't have to be that punchy. They just try and create a nice, thick, lush sound, and that takes some of the energy out of the song. I think about an alternative world where there never was Elvis, the solo star, but instead there was just this band, the Blue Moon Boys. And arguably that might have made Elvis a more interesting frontman. Think about Mick Jagger. Technically, he's not billed as Mick Jagger. He's billed as the Rolling Stones. And because of this creative partnership with his guitarist, Keith Richards, he arguably gets to have more of a larger than life persona than even Elvis did. And obviously he branched out into songwriting a few records into his career, which is something that Elvis was never encouraged, or it never occurred to him to do. I wonder if there's an alternative world where Scotty Moore was as big a star as Keith Richards, and it was about the band. It wasn't just about making Elvis into a superstar. Look, I'm not coming into this as someone who's looked too deeply into the controversy of people not liking the man who became his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. So I'm not going to speculate too much on who made what decision. But it does seem pretty clear to me that there was a decision made about Elvis after he left Sun Records that he wasn't going to be the quite the same performer of those rockabilly, of those Blue Moon Boys days, where he emphasized the lower part of his vocal range. I don't know if this was part of the whole King of Rock image. He wasn't allowed to be this rebellious young man. He had to be this silly, hunky man with a big voice. And that came at the expense, I think, of the rawness and the sincerity of his delivery. I recently attended a movie night where we watched what's considered one of Elvis's better movies, King Creole, though you wouldn't tell it from the picture here. It's a noir movie. It contains some great acting performances from Carolyn Jones and Walter Matthau. But like all the Elvis movies, Elvis is in there just playing a thinly hidden version of himself, this boy with a golden voice who goes around the adventures of the movie performing various songs. And I think the reaction people generally have to Elvis movies is that he was a bad actor. But I don't think that's fair because, again, you listen to the expression in some of these songs, like Now Again, There's a Fool Such as I, or Don't You Think It's Time? I think Elvis had a lot of potential as an actor. But someone was telling him being Elvis means talking like this, being this cool, over the top guy all the time. And if you're trying to be Elvis, well, you can't be a serious character like Danny Fisher in King Creole. You're being this, Las Vegas cool music guy. So yeah, I guess in conclusion, this CD is from the 50s. It's only a couple of years into Elvis's career, yet it feels late because he's began to make the decision to transform away from the rockabilly artist he once was. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good songs on here, but one can only wonder if Elvis could have been even better if he had, stayed with Sun Studios, stayed just him, Scotty Moore, Bill Black, and DJ Fontana, and been the best rockabilly singer he could have been. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.